Remember when we used to talk about the paperless office,
e-commerce,
signing a contract on paper,
and even giving out an agent's pager number?
We're in a mobile world.
We're in a mobile world, and your business needs to be too.
It's a digital world.
Workflow is changing, and so too are our experiences.
There are over 350 PropTech players right now
competing for the space.
How do you keep up with it all? And what's next?
Welcome to Founders,
a new podcast with Josh Phegan
on the future of workflow in real estate.
Welcome to Founders, and today we've got the incredible Steve Osborn joining us from Identity Marketing. Steve, it is awesome to have you in the studio today.
Yeah, it's really good to be here. Really excited to dive in and talk more about branding and what's happening in the real estate space.
Yeah, this is a really important conversation for every real estate agent. And there's an old school saying that I love, that if you're not planning on being the cheapest, then how are you planning on winning? And it must be about design. So if you think a little bit about what it is that you do, how you brand, package, and market yourself is really important for the types of audiences you want to go after, the types of customers that you actually want to get, and where you want to sit in the market for the fee that you're actually going to go and charge for the various services that happen inside of residential real estate business, from sales to property management, to off-plan, to commercial, to industrial. All of those things is thinking about what you as an agent are going to do. And now, no doubt, we're going to talk about a lot of things about where brands actually sit, where an agency actually sit, how you market an office, what you do to go to market an individual as a salesperson, and then what you do around like property marketing, to make sure that you're standing out and that you've got a brand standard around all of those things. So let's go and have a great conversation around that. And I know you want to talk a little bit about today about, brand and maybe even the conversation around positioning. What are some of the considerations and what are some of the things that you think about?
I think one of the key things that we get asked a lot is really when should we be refreshing our brand? Like, what's the time frame? Is this like every 3 years? Is this every 5 years? And I think that the truth in that is the most timeless brands are the ones that evolve the fastest. Mm-hmm. And when I mean evolve the fastest, I don't necessarily mean they change their logo. I mean they change all the elements around their logo. So they spend a lot of time considering their videography, their photography. They can spend a lot of time considering their messaging. And so if you look at maybe a brand that's slightly adjacent to real estate, like Airbnb, for example, every 6 months or every 12 months there's a new campaign that they've got. And that new campaign has a new style of videography, has some new messaging that goes with it. It goes on their website. It goes in all their print marketing, goes on all their outdoor ads, goes on everything that's on socials. And so then every time they do this, the brand feels current, it feels refreshed, and they're not actually changing the brand elements. They're just changing the marketing around the brand. And I think that's one thing that's really missing a lot inside of the property sector. You can go to a real estate agency website today and you can look at it 3 years ago and it still looks exactly the same. Mm-hmm. And the social content isn't really changing that much and the messaging is staying quite consistent. And so a lot of brands, all they need to do is just evolve the messaging, the look and the feel, and it can actually make the whole brand look current and modern and on trend.
It's kind of an interesting conversation because I talk to a lot of people that are like, Josh, should I do a rebrand? I'm like, well, in my opinion, the only reason that you do a rebrand is probably because you feel irrelevant in a marketplace. Now, what you're talking about is, okay, great. So first of all, the consideration is that, where does your brand actually going to go and sit? So what a lot of people do is that they're going to open a real estate office. It's a great idea. And then all of a sudden they go and have a look at all the franchises that are available in their area. Oh my goodness, all the franchises are taken. So we better create our own brand. And so then they're like, okay, so what does that look like? And some of that's done by ego and some of that's actually really done by careful consideration around what it's going to look like. And, people get into trouble because they might use their own name and then they find that hard to kind of expand. And then there's evolution, like do we call it Josh Phegan or do we just call it Phegan or do we call it Phegans? And then do we have real estate underneath it or property next to it? But really the most important foundational idea, I guess, for you is to say, okay, great, well, where do you want to be positioned? And I always say to people, when you think about brand, there might be like Louis Vuitton and there might be the Reject Shop. Now, both of them will sell a handbag, but the price at which they'll sell that handbag will be completely different. And if you think about it, like brand is really important because if you think about it, customer experience equals brand and brand equals pricing power. So Warren Buffett always says that pricing power is really, really important. And let's say, for example, you're at a restaurant and they said, hey, could I get some Coca-Cola? And they go, oh, look, we've got Pepsi. How do you feel in that moment? Like, do you feel like you're being sold, the lower tier product? And if they said, but look, I can get you Coca-Cola for an extra $1, would you pay the extra $1? And I reckon I know a lot of people that would, because they believe in that brand and the taste and all the things that go on with Coca-Cola as opposed to Pepsi. So this is really important to understand, where do you actually want to be positioned in marketplace? And then there's going to be some considerations to how you go to build that brand. How important is it, when you're building out a brand for someone, to have a look at, like, what are the types of competitors that exist in that marketplace? What's the demographic of the audience that you're actually going to be serving? And how do you actually want to be positioned in that particular market?
I mean, we always start with the customers and who are you actually trying to reach. So, for example, like if you think of Aesop,
It's a beautiful brand. Yeah, and it's worth billions, right?
Yeah, and it's very much like a minimalist skincare brand. They don't do any influencer advertising. There's none of that going on. It's just for people that really care about a good quality product and great design. There's none of this loud packaging there. And you can really tell that they've taken the time to actually understand who their customers are and what their customers actually want from their product. And if you sort of take that back to real estate for a second, if more real estate agencies spent time looking into, say, the 2 or 3 different customer types, if they spent 80% of their efforts in terms of brand and marketing, would have the biggest impact on their business. I think that's a really good place to start because if you can really identify that this is the type of customer that you serve, this is their needs, this is why they actually would have you come and serve them and look after them, this is their backstory, this is what they actually want from a real estate agency, then you can actually serve them really well and your marketing can reflect that, your brand can reflect that, and it feels like it's speaking directly to them. It's not that it's excluding people, but it's including the people that would have the biggest impact on your brand. And that can be certain property types, that can be different customer demographics, but really working out like who you are and why you're important and relevant to that brand.
Is it possible that like a brand is an attitude?
100%, yeah.
So if you start thinking about it, like, are we really in your face? Are we quite reserved? Are we high quality? Are we very bespoke? Are we available to everyone? And that's kind of like an accessibility conversation. And I look at it like, Patagonia, for example, is like an activist brand. So when they hear about some offshore drilling, they're like, we'll be out there, we'll be fighting in the streets for you. Whereas like, we're not that. So, Josh Phegan's not going to be around that. And we might have some views on that, but we don't have a need to have a view on that because that's not what our customer is about. When we're really clear about the demographic of what we're going for. And so this is interesting, where for renters or where for landlords or where for buyers or where for sellers. And when you're thinking about whatever your service line is, whether or not it's being a buyer's agent or being a real estate agency that, offers an essential services, you need to understand about where you sit in that marketplace. So, I know a brand, for example, where everyone's about, well, we're not wearing suits, no slick suits here. And like, okay, great. So what are you trying to communicate? More approachable, more accessible, better quality conversations. There are other brands, well, we're not talking slick suits, but we definitely want stylization and we're selling lifestyle. Then there's other brands that are a bit along the lines of, well, here's a house, just buy it. So you've got to start to think a bit about that. Now, inside of the brand, tell me what are the things that make up a brand. So the logo might include things like color. That might include typeface. It might include style of photography. There might be then sounds that actually go with 100%. That brand. So do you want to talk a bit about, getting that brand design right? Because I think that there are brands that have owned colours, and there's the favourite one of Cadbury actually suing Darryl Lee because Cadbury owned purple. And so when you think purple, you think chocolate, you think Cadbury. That was actually a really important foundational idea. Is it possible for a brand to own a colour, and can that colour instantly allow the customer to go, I know what that is, without even seeing the logo or the typeface?
Yeah, you can definitely do that with colours, and you see that all the time. Like when you're driving down the street and you see a signboard and it's a particular colour and you know that brand's in your area, you know it's that real estate agency just because of that colour. But colours is just one brand asset, and at the end of the day, like your brand isn't what you say it is, it's what your customer says it is. And so if you kind of take that back a step, your brand ultimately has thousands of variations out there. Like what I might think Nike is might be different to what you think Nike is. And the way that Nike and real estate agencies control their brand and what people say about it is through 3 core things, which is their messaging. So what do they say? What are they using in their campaigns? Through their visuals, which is their logos, their brand marks, how they use their logo, when they drop the real estate, when they keep the real estate, their colours, their fonts, maybe some patterns, and then through the customer experience. Like are they quick to call people back? Are they slow? Or are they like that really high-tech company and things happen for them? So controlling those 3 things really helps you control like what your brand is. And going back to that sort of brand assets conversation, colours is just one of them. But if you can get your colour or your shape or your pattern or whatever that is to be in someone's mind and they can remember that, it means that when they see that, they know who the brand is. It's like sort of driving down the street and seeing the golden arches. You know that's a McDonald's brand without reading the word McDonald's. McDonald's is big enough now that they don't have the word hamburgers underneath it anymore.
Right. Yeah. So this is interesting as a part of that, like, when you see people actually go and develop a brand, that then they've got to give considerations to, how do they actually want their agents to be presented? And so this is the conversation on the photography and the video style. is this is about how brands are now coming to life. So when it actually comes through into the digital environment, we're very hungry for digital assets in terms of audio, video, photography. Talk to us a little bit about that, about why stylization actually matters. Like, is black and white really authoritative? Whereas if you put a pastel color behind someone, is it a bit more fun and accessible?
Yeah, it really goes back to like where the brand's position in the market is. So like I'm holding a coffee in my hand at the moment. And so I've seen photos of real estate agents where they're holding the coffee in front of like the local coffee shop, and they're a little bit more approachable. They've got like maybe like some nice pants on, nice slacks, and like a shirt on, and they look professional, but there's no tie, there's no suit jacket. And what they're really trying to do is position themselves as that sort of local friendly real estate agent. And then I imagine a lot of their events that they do would probably be around doing local events. A lot of their marketing would be around like what's happening locally. And so like really tying everything back into where that agency is positioned in the market.
And this is an important conversation because when you think about it, like the brand has got to have a series of assets. And what we're looking at doing now is saying, okay, how do we go to produce that? So one of the things that we do is that like we go into a photo studio once a year with our photographer, and Chris takes some incredible photos, believe it or not, like 600 of them, to then find out like the 5 or 6 key photos that we might use all year in terms of like, you know, when we're at major events or some of those types of things, but a whole heap of like B-reel type photography that we can use for other things, like the back of a brochure or something as a part of a slide or some of those things.
Some of those Instagram reel covers and things like that.
Yeah. So how important is it for someone to say, okay, great, when you're developing a brand, you then need to start to think about the assets that you're going to create. And if you're thinking about photography, how do you want your people photographed? How do you want your properties photographed? How do you want your offices photographed? And then having a quick look at then when you go to video, how do you want videos to look and how do you want them to sound? So as a part of that, are there sound effects? Is there a particular type of music that you're going to use? Are you in a position that ultimately you're doing specific things in those videos in the edit? And, you know, this is an interesting thing about brand considerations. We built a type form that we're going to show this year at Blueprint. And it's like, okay, great, I'm a real estate agent. You know, would I like to appear in the videos? Yes, no. And if you say no, no problems, then there's a particular video style that you can produce where Josh Phegan presents 123 Smith Street. You know, just like, for example, when you have a look at Jurassic Park and you think Steven Spielberg presents Jurassic Park, but Steven Spielberg wasn't on the front of the video presenting Jurassic Park. And so you can actually have brand iconology. Other brands, for example, they want the agent front and center. Other brands, they want the agent's fingers gliding across the kitchen bench, but they want the sound effects of the toast popping and the kids running through that kitchen and maybe the fireplace crackling away or the birds tweeting outside.
Selling the lifestyle
around that. But, you know, the production assets. And so this is why it's really, really important to understand how you market property also will position where the brand sits. So when you go to the major real estate websites, how quickly does the brand show? Then when you actually get into the photography and the videography of the property, does that create asset styles? And then even the way that copy is being written, in the chat GPT era, is it important that businesses have actually got a clear format around how they write copy? And is it, you know, all bullet points or is it long prose or short prose? And, you know, what sort of headings do we use? And, you know, to getting really clear about that. Is that the sort of stuff that literally you spend hours agonizing over to get right for brands and maybe even just giving them choices? Do you want this or do you want this? And so then that way they can make it really easy in terms of building out their brand profile with you.
Yeah, you'd be surprised about how much time we spend considering one word over another when it comes to messaging. So if you're thinking of like property messaging, we spend a lot of time working out like what's a framework that the agents can use for property headings. So like if you look going back to say like your brand and your brand expression, one part we look a lot is the verbal identity. And so that looks at how the brand communicates and then how the agent should then be communicating when they're actually talking about property in their property copy. So working out like what do the headlines look like? What do they sound like? How does that tie back into the brand's position in the market? And then the body copy, like do we write the whole thing in paragraph format or do we break it up into different parts? Do we have bullet points? And so just getting that sort of consistent makes a huge difference because it feels like every single property is being communicated the same way and it feels like it's coming from a brand. Yeah. And so like if you look at any brand, say like any clothing brand, it always has a consistent voice, a consistent way of communicating. And then looking back again at say like the visuals of a brand, and sort of leaning more into social media. I often think social media is a lot like a storefront that you'd walk past out the front and you always see in the people's storefronts, like their best like products are in the storefront. Like you're not promoting your worst things. And so, well, if you take that then back to real estate, what you really want to be doing is making sure that you've got great videography, but you've also got like a certain style
Yes.
that the company has. And you've also got like a consistent way of doing the intros, consistent way of doing the outros, consistent way of how the text appears on screen. You've got options for when agents, like you said before, are in the video, options when agents aren't in the video.
Yeah.
Making sure there's some consistent filters and sound effects. So when someone sees that video, they go, oh yeah, this is this brand. A little bit like that, the conversation we had earlier about driving past McDonald's and recognizing the golden arches. And I think it's really important as well for a lot of agencies to really take the time to evolve that. So what you'll probably find is if you do that really well, your competitor's going to start to copy. And so then start doing, once you start seeing it being copied, then let's start evolving it again.
Yeah.
And that's sort of how you stay in front of your competitors, keep your brand relevant and keep it looking consistent for a longer period of time and don't need to go back and refresh your brand because you've just got great marketing out there. And it's really important that you just train the videographers then in the standards.
And this is interesting about like, we're now seeing real estate brands, for example, own language. And I think that like one of the most famous lines of all time is probably from Gavin Rubinstein, where he comes in and says, welcome home. And welcome home is like an icon for the TRG group. And so when you start thinking about it, they've really lent into understanding that you can own the language that the brand actually uses and how it actually goes and speaks. And this is kind of an interesting foundational idea. It's interesting that when you're thinking about it, and I assume that every single time you do a brand or a rebrand or a midlife refresh, and when I say midlife refresh, people are like, what do you mean? Well, most cars probably run for 10 years, but literally in the 5-year mark, they do a refresh where they change the grille and maybe they change the lights or they do a slight improvement on the internal. But the rest of it's pretty much exactly the same car. And so sometimes you can do a midlife refresh, which is what you're talking about, where all of the other things that are around that marketing messaging can change, but the actual brand identity can go to stay the same. But it's really about getting clear. So what's the problem that we're actually trying to solve? Are we trying to recruit more agents? I think that like Compass in America did a really good job of that with agent identity and agent logos as a part of their brand suite. Are we in a position that we're trying to make sure that people are aware of additional service lines? So all of a sudden you've got Josh Phegan Real Estate, but then underneath it you've got residential sales, property management, commercial sales and leasing, you know? So like just to get really clear, we do all of this. And I think that's the problem is that sometimes people are like, oh, I'm doing sales, but no one knows we've got a property management business. Should we put property management as like a strap line underneath it to actually make sure that people are aware of the service lines? And how long do we keep real estate in the name before we get rid of that? Or do we call it estate agents because it's more prestigious? Or do we call it property or properties? These types of things that people come to you, are you sometimes amazed at the maze that people have got themselves into? Or is there a point where a brand is maturing enough that it can afford to have those additional service lines taken off now because the brand is powerful enough? Do you like to start that day one that they've got the service lines clearly enunciated? Or are you okay not to do that in the way that you think about positioning in a brand?
Yeah, I don't think you need to have your service lines in there.
Yeah.
I think of our company, for example, we do a lot of branding, we do a lot of marketing, we do a lot of strategy.
Sure.
Like our tagline isn't branding, marketing, strategy.
Yeah.
And so if you take that then back to real estate, if we start firstly with like the name extension. So like if I'm driving, and I'll use an example outside of real estate. If I'm driving down the street and I see a car for like a landscaper, maybe it's called like Osborn landscaping. Straight away I know that that's a landscaper.
Yeah, sure.
If they take off the word landscaping, I don't know it's a landscaper.
Sure.
Right, and then if you take that then back into, say, like real estate, if I see Osborn on the side of a car without the word real estate, I have no idea what the context of that is. If that's the first time I'm seeing that logo. But if I'm an REA and I see the word Osborn on a listing, I've got a pretty good idea that that's a real estate agency.
Yeah, sure.
Same if I see that on a signboard. And then maybe on an office, you might need to have the word real estate or estate agents or whatever the variation is on that. And so like that category extension, you don't necessarily need to have it everywhere. And so a lot of new companies that start, they say, oh, well, we're new, we need to sort of get that awareness out there of what we do. And it's like, well, you don't need to have that everywhere.
Yes.
Just sort of consider where that needs to go. And then when it goes back to services, I think a website can do a really powerful job of saying what your services are. So if someone's going to your homepage on your website, you can obviously explain what you do in some really nice visual way, video, photography, however you want to do that. But also if you think of the navigation across the top of your website, if it just said like buy, lease, commercial, like those 3 words tell me straight away what you do. And then the fourth one might be appraise or contact or something along those lines as the sort of main call to action to drive that conversion.
Founders is brought to you by Josh Phegan Digital. When we were setting out to go and create Josh Phegan Digital, we just had this whole idea that we wanted training to be on demand. And everything in our life is on demand. We just press play inside of the Netflix app. We press play on YouTube, play on Spotify. Why couldn't we just press play on training? And what we decided is we want to be like super relevant to real estate agents so that in under a couple of minutes each day, if you wanted to, you could upskill and you could grow in new ways. And so we decided that we were going to release this thing that we called The Edit, which is basically the latest in property news stories that's happening every week right the way around the country. So you could be incredibly sharp in your conversations with sellers. And then we built out the short courses, which was all about rapidly building skills, whether or not it's about learning how to get better fees or to put on an assistant. And then we actually wanted to give you access to blueprints, so you didn't have to wait for it every year. You could just watch it whenever you wanted and actually go from zero to hero around everything that it takes, from goal setting, self and energy management, what you're doing around prospecting, listing, negotiation, and actually just have a system for the way that you work. Together with, getting really inspired by some of the best people in the industry with the black and white interviews. Josh Phegan Digital is available on iOS and also on Android. It's an incredible app and it gives you everything that you'll need to be a much better agent. It's time to switch on.
One of the things that we're doing a lot of work with a brand up in Brisbane, and they really leaned into the idea that request appraisal didn't work anymore. And so what they did is they changed it to get a quote. And so you get a quote for property management or you get a quote for selling their services, right, as a sales business. Interesting conversation. They did that since January this year. And on average, they're winning 30 new managements a month because they changed it to get a quote. And what they realized is that we did analysis on the understanding of like how many of their managements that were coming in were new supply. So in other words, someone's bought a property and is now going to change it into being a rental versus how many of them were takeovers where they're taking it over from another property management company and they're therefore unhappy with the previous level of service that they've been provided with an alternate service provider.
Yeah.
And so what they realized is that 80% were takeovers. So only 20% were new, but 80% were takeovers where people were really unhappy. And I don't need an appraisal if it's a takeover. What I actually want you to do is just tell me how much does your service cost and I'll tell you whether or not I'll use you. So they change it to get a quote and it's really smart, the form, because you go and you fill in the basic details. And then when you do that, they use what they call guilt form technology. So there's like a whole series of questions and then they ask the contact details. And it's amazing because you're like, woo, 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 woo. And like you got to then give your detail. But the interesting foundational idea is that like literally changing it to get a quote, building out the form, making sure that it's really fun for people to fill out. They're getting 30 managements, thinking about $2,000 a pop, $60,000 in annual recurring revenue per month. Times that by 10, that's 600,000 in annual recurring revenue. Times that by 3, that's 1.8 million in saleable value. So what you got to realize is that do you actually know what you're doing? And when sometimes I go to a real estate agency's website, I'm like, let me give you my details because I would like you to manage my property and there's nowhere to do it. And I've got a tunnel and funnel and I've got to click 6 different things to somehow get to the form. And it's like literally you've got to understand what are the activations on that website, the button that you click that literally lets people communicate and connect with you that's not in a full-in way. And if you have a look at, like, I reckon most real estate agents have never had anyone fill out the appraisal form. And if they did, they don't even know if it works because like it's so long and it's in-depth detail. I need to give my mother's maiden name, but you're not thinking about customer experience. Is that critical? Because like, you look at how we do brand marketing and then how we do agent marketing. And one of the things I do with our change agent winners every year is the first thing I do is I type their name into Google and I literally open up the first 20 pages that come on the search results. And now people are like, oh my goodness, like, geez, that's an old photo. And there's my clubbing photos from Ibiza in 2014. And they're not thinking about positioning and branding. Is that stuff important to make sure that your agents have got a suite of tools that they can access in stylization of photography, building out their strap lines, understanding how they're going to look in marketplace so it's consistent across the brand? Because when you've got one salesperson versus 600 salespeople, I assume that they're different challenges, but you need to make sure that's Loctite.
Yeah, it's definitely worth taking the time to jump on Google and to type your name in there and to have people that work in marketing to type the agent's name in there and just see what comes up, because you can guarantee those first 2 pages are being seen by the general public. And then looking back and making sure that you've got great photography. There are a lot of people that we work with, they're getting photos done a couple of times a year as a minimum. And because, digital is just so hungry for assets. And so they're needing new photos to put as covers for their reels. They're needing new photos for the team. They might have a photo in the background with maybe their contact details at the end of, like, say, a carousel that's used for a property listing, for example. And that just sort of has a much better lifestyle look and much better positioning on socials than say, having like your photo in a circle that you'd see on like REA or Domain. And so, yeah, getting that right really makes a lot of sense. But then also sort of going back to the conversation about websites, homepages just aren't the only places that people land on. And so when we're building out websites, we spend a lot of time looking at like where are your customers actually coming from, and what you were saying before about people who are unhappy with their property management, they're probably searching for key things like property manager near me, or property manager in Balmain, or wherever that is. And so making sure that you've got landing pages as entry points to the website, and then making sure that the heading aligns with what people are actually searching for. There's a nice video on there. It shows maybe some of the properties you've listed or sold in that area, frequently asked questions on there, maybe some testimonials, and a clear contact form to actually get the process moving. Because what we see is a lot of people will run Google ads for like property manager near me, and then it takes them back to the homepage. And the homepage mentions nothing about property management, mentions nothing about, oh, you're unhappy with your current property manager, this is what we can do and how we're different and how we can help. So just really thinking it through from the customer's point of view to actually make it work better from a conversion point of view. And if you can get that right, you don't need to spend a lot more money on marketing. You just need to be doing it in a better way, which is exactly what you were talking about then with the get a quote feature.
So if you think about this, about like we've got physical, which is a lot of the point of sale type stuff. And so that's the really things that we touch, or the touchable, which is like signboards and pointer boards and flags, and brochures and disclosure documents and auctioneer regulations and, bidding cards, when someone actually goes to bid at an auction. Like, how important is it to get the physical stuff right, that, the text is legible, the QR code is scannable, if it's going to be a sign that's going to be up on the top of an awning, that you can actually read the agent's phone number, and thinking about the age profile and demographic. And also too, I've seen people that have built brands, but then the printers and the signboard companies are using completely different versions of that color.
Yeah.
How important is it for consistency here, and to make sure that your physical, touchable, tangible assets look smart and look clean?
Well, everything that you do from your brand sends a message. And so if you've got your colors are different and they're obviously different on different things, like that's sending a message, and it's not the message you want it to be sending. And so when we do a lot of that type of work, we work with the printers. We make sure that they've got like the Pantone book. We're getting them to reference that, getting them to do print checks, because when you do printing, depending on how much ink's in the printer, depending on the paper stock that you're using, it can really change the outcome. Like choosing a color on a computer is very different to having it actually print in real life.
Yes.
And there's a few steps that you need to do in the middle to make sure it's consistent. And one of the key things is working with the same supplier. If you're constantly changing your printing supplier, you've got 5 or 6 different ones that are all using different stocks, you'll find that it's going to print differently. And ultimately that comes down to sort of brand expression when you're thinking about like what people are actually seeing in the real world. So like you said before, the flags, the signboards, it's really important that it's cohesive with what people are seeing online. So if you've got certain messaging online, you want to make sure you've got that same message offline and in the real world as well. You want to make sure the colours are the same. You want it to feel like a cohesive brand experience between the real world and the online world.
So when you got to think about like digital assets, because physical you can touch and see, when it comes to the digital experience, what actually happens there? So when you're looking at a website, when you're looking at any of the social media platforms, when you're looking at your email signatures, right the way through to how does someone actually fill out a form? How do they make an offer? What do your forms look like internally for your own staff? What sort of technology do you use to be able to gather and capture information to then make sure that ultimately you're building up this great experience? And this is what we're seeing a lot of. One client, for example, tells us that literally he sends out an SMS with a quick little pre-survey prior to every listing presentation. 85% of people fill it in. The 15% that don't never list with him. And of the 85% that do fill it in, he wins 90% of those listings.
How good is that as a qualifier?
Right. But here's the key thing, is that like the look of the form has got to look like the brand.
Yeah.
And the language that you use and how you speak is really, really important. And where you see that like a lot of agents get let down is that they never put themselves in the customer's shoes. And I think one of my favorite things to do is to say, okay, I take a random person off the street. It's okay, great. Now go to this website and I want you to put your details in to sell your house, or I want you to put your details in to lease out your investment property. And it's so frustrating because the agent's like, no, just go to the left or just click that button up to the right. But the modern customer can't actually navigate to that because the language is not clear about what you do. So when you think about like buy, sell and lease, well, okay, great. Well, buying's buying, selling, lease. Well, what is that? Is that for a tenant or is that for a landlord? And do we put manage, but does the landlord understand the word manage? So like, and this is where this whole challenge gets. It's like, guys, just put get a quote button up there. Get a quote for us to manage your property. Get a quote for us to sell your property. Use language that insurance companies have really drummed into everyone else. And if you can get that right, then you can own it. And I think that a really good example of this was, probably Bressic Whitney did a phenomenal job of actually having off-market. So when you went to the BW website, here is off-market or only available on bw.com.au. And so they got really, really clear about actually understanding how to go to position, whereas a lot of other people go to develop extra features.
Well, going back to that off-market, it's such a good opportunity to actually work out what's your customer's journey look like. So we see a lot of people will, and we'll do it for them, we'll build these off-market platforms as part of their website. But then from there, there's no sort of follow-up. And so at this point, you've probably just got the customer's email, maybe their name. Most of the off-market places we see don't even have the phone numbers. And so what you can quite easily do now is have an automated email sent to them just asking them if they'd like, for example, an instant property estimate, but then put their address in. So now you've got this sort of
Capture tool.
database happening. And so you can even ask them to pop in their mobile number to get the instant estimate. So now they've registered their email, you've got their address, and you've got their mobile number. And as part of that instant estimate, they're saying when they're thinking of selling. So there's some really clever ways you can start to use digital to really build out what's happening inside of your database.
One of the interesting spaces, and this is rapidly emerging for agents, is consumers off Google, but now going into AI and searching. So, hey, I'm in a position that I need to sell my 3-bedroom house in this area. It's worth XYZ. Which real estate agent should I choose? Deep research. So they're using, whether or not it be Grok or Claude or ChatGPT as an example, they're typing that in, and then it's going and doing deep research, and it's crawling over like 30 different websites and 300 different searches to then come out with an idea. And it's really interesting to watch how those tools are looking and then how they're then ranking. Is this like critical for an agent now to understand that if you're going to win in the digital age, where do you put reviews? When do you put reviews up? What are you actually publishing in terms of the digital world? What sort of content have you got out there? How are you collaborating about listings and sales? Because these tools are looking at that to then give consumers advice on who they should use as an agent.
Well, I know I use ChatGPT to search all the time, especially when I'm trying to find a product and I don't feel like looking at 5 or 6 different websites anymore, which happens a lot now. And it does look at the Google reviews. And I think one thing that agents can do to dramatically improve their Google reviews, because the vast majority I hear from the bad negative ones that come, they often say has to do with that sort of rental side of the property, rental side of the business, sorry. And so people leave bad feedback when they've got nowhere to leave feedback. So if they tried to call a property manager or they've tried to call an agent, feel like they're not going anywhere. The only place they can go is online. And so I think for smart real estate agencies, what they can do is have a form on their website where they can leave feedback and they can leave that sort of 1 to 5 star. And so if they hit the 5-star button, it takes them through to Google and they can leave the review. If they hit anything below 5-star, they can type it into the form and they can complete the form and it goes through and it gets taken seriously by the company.
And this is kind of like the most important conversation. Can you tell straight away whether or not a brand is well designed?
Straight away,
yeah. So like I was having a look at a new entrant to the real estate industry in Australia recently, and it's a very, very significant franchise business. And the interesting thing is I went to the website and they have property management as their main name. And now they also do sales and they also do buyer advocacy. And then when you go to type in the form, the address details for where you can put the address of the property is like 10 times bigger than every other field. So I'm not sure if I'm supposed to put my entire portfolio in. But then when it goes, how did you find out about us? And it's supposed to say search engine, but they misspelt the word search. And so like I look at this stuff and then I go to have a look at their reviews, and none of the reviews are about their property related services. It's about other service lines that they've got that are not in the real estate industry. And I'm just like, wow, like it's really clear that whoever's ever put this together doesn't actually understand the real estate industry and doesn't actually understand how to go to pitch towards the customer's, innate desires. And they're not clear about what the website is designed to do. So is this about awareness? Is this about conversion? Are you in a position that you want someone to buy something, or are you in a position that you want someone to engage with something? And so we were really clear that when we put together our own website with on every page, it can only have one of two goals. Either to capture the client's information, aka subscribe to a daily email, or for them to buy a product or service.
Yeah.
So on every page, it's either capture information or it's buy a service. It's not both, it's either one. And so this is actually really important to say, okay, great. How beautiful is the design? Does it make you want to go on to that and to register your details and to make that look easy, or does it look ugly and does it look like no one's ever used it? And I think that this is really important. Steve, one of the things that you've done for a lot of people is brand audits. where you literally just go and you have a look at all their stuff and you're like, whoa, like, yep, no. How important is that as an exercise to start with, for someone to start that journey on what they could do and to then get really clear about what their objective is, whether or not it be market share growth or recruitment capability or geographical expansion or service line expansion, to get, clear that there's an objective of why you would go down the track of a rebrand or the launch of a new marketing campaign, to assist in the growth of those service lines.
Yeah, so a lot of the brand audit work that we do tends to come more from like a strategy point of view, which is essentially a strategy. Someone has a business goal and they want to get there, and they need the marketing or the branding as part of the vehicle to help them get there, and they're just not sure exactly what they need to do. They've got some idea, and so what they do is they come to us, they start that conversation, and we always start with like the brand audit. So we ask them to send through all the print stuff that they've got, all of the things that we can't see online. We ask them, what their goals are, what are some of the problems that they're currently finding, and then we go through, we audit all the things, and we're like, well, this... you're using different language here to what you're using over here. You've got this color going on over here that isn't in your style guide. You've got these fonts that you're using, again, not in your brand guide. And then we can start having that conversation with them, and we start to realize that, okay, in their brand guide, they weren't entirely happy with what they had, but they didn't feel like they could speak to whoever the designer was at the time when they made their brand. And so they kind of went off and they made their own thing. Or it might have been that they just had a new marketing manager come into the company, and the marketing manager, which happens all the time in property, isn't a graphic designer. And so they don't actually know how to translate a brand guide. They understand colors and fonts, but they don't actually understand like the brand expression and maybe percentages of colors and things like that. And so you start to see these signboards or these different marketing collateral pieces that don't really follow the brand guidelines, and the marketing manager really doesn't know that because they've never been trained to do that. And I think a lot of people that run real estate companies don't actually understand that that's like two different degrees, like graphic designer versus like marketing, very different qualifications. And so we start to sort of understand what their problems are. And then from there, what we'll often do is say, look, your brand's okay. You don't actually need to do it. You need to evolve the things around it. Or it might be, look, it's time, guys, to actually do this refresh. Like your company is, let's call it 50 years old, and it's starting to look tired. That has a compounding effect, which starts to make you look old-fashioned. And that's not what we want for you. So it is time to refresh the overall brand. Let's tighten up the messaging. Let's get some new deliverables out in the marketplace. Let's get a campaign that we can really just push out there and get that going out to people.
Yeah, then the interesting conversations that I see agents, for example, that might change brand. So they'll work for a particular brand and they go and work for a new brand.
You don't want to do that too much.
And the crazy thing I see is that literally they've got 500 posts with the previous brand, and they started the new one, and they have one post that they've now started at the new office, and then there's no extra posting going on for 6 weeks, and you're like, did they die? Are they successful? Is that not a good brand choice? And I'm like, how important is it for people to start to think about collaboration, about sharing of content? And are you brave enough to be Taylor Swift and just archive all the previous content for when you've actually joined the new brand and really hit it out? Because people are watching about that internal success and, sharing other properties that have been listed by the business and sharing other video content and collaborating. This is a really good chance where a lot of agencies have actually got to get a proper strategy together to actually understand how to collab and what sort of content to collab on and when to produce content and what it actually looks like.
Yeah.
And I've got a good example of that where I go into a brand at the moment and I'll do some speaking and training for them. And before I leave at 2:30 every afternoon, they've already got the video out that I've been in there to go and do the training for them.
Yeah.
And then over the next 72 hours, it will then appear on different Instagram accounts across their direct group and also to their partner group.
They've really switched on
about that. So they've got a real plan around that. So Steve, if someone was in a position that they're saying, hey, I need help. I need to get a proper brand. I need to do a rebrand. I need to establish a brand. I'm an agent. I want to get really clear about my agent marketing. I want to know what tools are available, from tactical and practicals like DLs in a trifecta pack for just listed, auction this week, now sold, conversations around QR coding, what they're doing on their signage, the look and feel of that, down to their digital strategy, being in a position that they start to really think about how they go to position, even down to, the production of that content and guidance, for the photographers or the videographers in their marketplace. They would come to you for that, right?
Yeah, definitely. Visit our website, identitymarketing.com.au, and that's ultimately where a lot of the conversations start, where we really start to lean into, what's the actual problem that you're trying to solve here? How can we help you get from where you are to where you want to be? Because ultimately, we see a lot of companies that we get that right for, they go on to have really good growth because, you've got a choice. You can grow through brand, or you can grow through salespeople, or you can grow through both. And you see that sometimes, especially in some of the sectors around real estate where they've got great brands and the real estate agencies are chasing them versus like the companies that want to be selling to people in real estate. They've got great salespeople and they're harassing real estate agents. You know, and that's sort of like the difference between like being a brand-driven business or being a sales-driven business. If you can get both of them right, you can have incredible growth.